watch our wonderful selves on television. Where's that human workhorse you call a husband?
Saturday mornings in 1967. You'd wake up early, pour yourself a bowl of cereal, and plant yourself in front of the TV because something special was about to come on. A show about 4 unlikely heroes who flew through space, battled impossible villains, and bickered like a real family the whole time. It was something nobody had ever seen on a Saturday morning before. So today, we're going back to where it all began, with the Fantastic Four. 1967, 15 weird facts you didn't know. Fact 15. It all started with a kid reading a comic book. The whole thing began not in a boardroom or a Hollywood pitch meeting, but with a boy sitting on a couch, reading a comic book. In the fall of 1966, a television agent named Cy Fisher noticed his son Stuart flipping through a Fantastic Four issue. Curious, he asked Stuart whether he'd want to see it turned into a cartoon. The kid's answer was an enthusiastic yes. Fisher took that gut reaction seriously. The very next day, he called up Joseph Barbera, the co-founder of Hanna-Barbera Productions, and pitched him the idea over the phone. Barbera read the comic himself, agreed it had real potential, and together, the two of them reached out to Stan Lee at Marvel Comics. A deal was struck, a pitch was put together, and ABC bought the show for its fall 1967 Saturday morning lineup. That's how fast things could move back then. And to think, it all happened because a kid was sitting at home with a comic. What's worth appreciating about that story is what it says about the era. Today, adapting a Marvel property into any kind of media involves years of development, endless committee meetings, and enough legal review to fill a filing cabinet.
Planet, no living thing shall remain. Then I will move on in my...
Back in 1966, a father noticed his son enjoying a comic, picked up the phone, and within a relatively short window, a deal was in place. The industry was young enough and loose enough that passion and a quick phone call could set something genuinely big in motion. Stuart Fisher probably had no idea what he'd helped start. Fact 14. This was Marvel's second animated show, but the first to focus on just one team. By the time the Fantastic Four cartoon premiered on September 9, 1967, Marvel had already dipped its toes into animation. In 1966, Grand Trey Lawrence Animation had produced The Marvel Superheroes, a syndicated package show that rotated through segments featuring Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, the Hulk, and the Submariner. But that show was a very different beast. It used extremely limited animation, essentially just moving the existing comic book panels around on screen with minimal motion. Characters' mouths would open and close. A fist might pan across the frame, but the images themselves were lifted almost directly from the printed pages of the comics. It was cheap, it was fast, and it got the job done. But it wasn't what most people would call full animation. The Fantastic Four, on the other hand, was produced by Hanna-Barbera and animated from the ground up with original character artwork, backgrounds, and movement. It was the first Marvel property to receive that kind of full original animation treatment, and the first to be dedicated entirely to a single comic book series, rather than rotating between characters. Hanna-Barbera was the gold standard for Saturday morning television at that point. They'd already produced The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo wasn't far off, and their superhero output, Space Ghost, Birdman, was defining what animated action could look like on a weekly basis. Having them produce a Marvel series was a genuine step up in ambition, and it showed on screen. That made it a significant step forward for Marvel on television, even if it only lasted one season.
Now to plot the angle and compass heading.
Fact 13. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were consultants on the show. The creators of the Fantastic Four didn't just hand over the rights and walk away. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the legendary duo who had created the team back in 1961, served as consultants during the production of the series. Their involvement helped keep the show grounded in the spirit of the comics. The writing team, Phil Hahn and Jack Hanrahan, drew heavily from the original Lee and Kirby stories, and many episodes even credited the specific comic book issue they were adapted from on the title cards. It was a level of reverence for the source material that wasn't always common in Saturday morning cartoons of the era. A lot of adaptations of that period took the name and the concept and then went off and did essentially whatever they wanted. Not this one. You could feel the difference in the storytelling. The show tackled genuine science fiction concepts, parallel dimensions, cosmic entities, alien civilizations, because those were the kinds of stories Lee and Kirby had been telling in the comics. That wasn't accidental. It came from having the people who built the original world still connected to how it was being presented. That level of creative involvement from the original authors was rare in Saturday morning television, and it's a big part of why the show felt more substantial than most of its peers. Fact 12. Alex Toth redesigned the characters for animation. When you think of Hanna-Barbera's superhero output from the late 1960s, Space Ghost, Birdman, the Herculoids, there's a visual clarity and boldness to those designs that holds up even today.
I have failed. Failed nothing. Let me at.
A lot of that is owed to one man, Alex Toth. Toth was a legendary comic book and animation artist who worked regularly with Hanna-Barbera during this period, and he was brought in to redesign the Fantastic Four characters for the cartoon. His approach simplified and sharpened the characters, making them suitable for the animation process of the time while keeping them immediately recognizable. Working in Saturday morning television in 1967 meant working within serious constraints. There was limited time, limited budget, and the characters needed to move cleanly at lower frame rates than theatrical animation. Toth understood that problem better than almost anyone. He knew that a character with too much detail would fall apart at the edges when animated on a tight production schedule. So he stripped things back, not crudely, but intelligently. He kept what mattered and cut what would only cause problems down the line. The look Toth gave the show, clean lines, strong silhouettes, and a no-nonsense visual style, was noted by critics and animation historians as one of the reasons the series held up better aesthetically than other cartoons of the era. If you go back and watch an episode today, the characters still read well on screen. That's not luck. His fingerprints are all over the look of that show.
To touch them is to perish.
Fact 11. Reed and Sue were already married, unlike in the comics. Here's a subtle change that casual viewers might never have noticed. In the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby comic, Reed Richards and Sue Storm were not yet married when the series began in 1961. They were a couple, sure, but they didn't actually tie the knot until Fantastic Four Annual Number 3, published in 1965. That issue was a genuine event at the time, complete with a guest appearance from a who's who of Marvel characters, and it sold exceptionally well. The animated series, however, decided to skip all of that backstory and simply present them as husband and wife right from the start. This was done partly for simplicity and partly to keep the storytelling clean for a Saturday morning audience. A will they won't they romantic tension might have worked well in a serialized monthly comic, but it was harder to sustain in a cartoon where episodes didn't necessarily air in order and where the audience skewed toward children rather than dedicated adult readers. Outside of flashback sequences set before the team was formed, Reed and Sue in the cartoon are firmly a married couple throughout all 20 episodes. Their dynamic in the show is that of a husband and wife who happen to be superheroes, bickering occasionally, caring for each other deeply, and navigating the extraordinary situations that came with being part of the Fantastic Four. It's a small thing, but it actually changes the texture of their relationship on screen, trading the romantic uncertainty of the comics for something more grounded and settled. Fact 10. Namor the Submariner had to be replaced twice. One of the stranger behind-the-scenes stories from this show involves a character who never actually appeared in it at all, Namor the Submariner. In the comics, Namor was a significant figure in the early years of the Fantastic Four. He appeared in multiple major storylines, as a villain, as an anti-hero, and as someone with a complicated romantic interest in Sue Storm. But when Hanna-Barbera went to use him in the cartoon, there was a problem. The animation rights to Namor had already been claimed by Grant Trey Lawrence Animation, which was using him in the Marvel Superheroes syndicated show.
I call down my spear and prepare to leave you.
So, when the 1967 series needed to adapt Fantastic Four stories that featured Namor, the writers had to create a replacement character. They invented Prince Triton of Pacifica, a blue-skinned underwater ruler whose kingdom was renamed from Atlantis to Pacifica to avoid any confusion with the character they couldn't use. Same general role, completely different name and look. Viewers who hadn't read the comics would never have known anything was missing. But for anyone who had, the absence of Namor was noticeable throughout the entire run of the show. Fact 9. The show aired the same morning as Spider-Man, Saturday, September 9th, 1967. A BC's lineup. If you were a young Marvel fan sitting in front of your television that morning, you had quite a schedule ahead of you, because the Fantastic Four wasn't the only Marvel cartoon making its debut that season. Spider-Man, the animated series that would become iconic in its own right, with one of the most memorable theme songs in cartoon history, premiered on ABC the very same day. The two shows aired on the same network, on the same Saturday morning, essentially back-to-back. Think about what that morning meant. Two Marvel properties, both brand new, both reaching a national television audience simultaneously. Kids who had been reading those comics at the drugstore or the newsstand suddenly had their favorite characters moving and talking on the screen. That kind of thing had never happened before for Marvel. DC had long since established a presence in animation. Superman had been on film and television for decades. But Marvel was the new arrival, and September 9th, 1967 was the moment it arrived in force. While Spider-Man would go on to become a much bigger cultural phenomenon, largely on the strength of that theme song and the character's broader appeal, the Fantastic Four was right there alongside it for that first season. The two shows represented Marvel's opening bet on Saturday morning television, and it was a confident one. Looking back, it's a morning that Marvel fans of a certain age remember very well.
Flame on!
Fact 8. Galactus was colored green in the cartoon. Fans of the comics know Galactus very well, the planet-devouring cosmic entity with his iconic purple armor and imposing presence. But if you tuned in to the Fantastic Four cartoon in December of 1967 to see the animated debut of this legendary villain, you might have done a double take. In the episode simply titled Galactus, the character was depicted with green skin and green armor, a notable departure from his purple and blue comic book appearance. He was also drawn as only slightly taller than the members of the Fantastic Four themselves, rather than the enormously towering figure from the pages of the comics. Some of this came down to the production limitations of Saturday morning animation in the 1960s. Rendering a truly massive character consistently across scenes was a challenge, and keeping his scale accurate relative to the human characters would have required painstaking work that the schedule and budget simply didn't allow for. Making him a more human-scaled figure was a practical workaround. But the green skin, that's a harder one to explain away. Color choices in animation of that era sometimes came down to simple miscommunication between creative teams or to the practical limitations of the color palette being used in production. Whatever the reason, viewers who had been following Galactus in the pages of Fantastic Four would have been surprised to see him rendered in shades of green rather than the deep purple they'd come to associate with the character. It remains one of the more visually surprising details about the show for anyone going back to watch it today. Fact 7. Galactus was voiced by the man who played Lurch. Speaking of the Galactus episode, the voice behind that iconic cosmic villain was none other than Ted Cassidy. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. Ted Cassidy was the towering actor, standing 6 feet 9 inches tall, best known for playing Lurch, the slow-moving, deep-voiced butler on The Addams Family, which had run on ABC from 1964 to 1966. His distinctive bass voice made him a natural choice for voicing an all-powerful, world-eating space god. Cassidy would later return to Fantastic Four animation in a very different capacity. In the 1978 series, The Fantastic Four, produced by Deepachi Freleng, he provided the voice of Ben Grimm, the Thing. So the same man who was Galactus in 1967 became one of the heroes in 1978. Fact 6. Paul Frees voiced multiple characters, including the Watcher. Paul Frees was one of the most prolific voice actors in Hollywood history. By the time the Fantastic Four cartoon came along in 1967, he had already worked on hundreds of radio programs, films, and television productions. In the Fantastic Four, he was cast as the Thing, Ben Grimm, giving the character his familiar Brooklyn accent that critics singled out as one of the standout performances in the series. But Frees didn't stop there. He also voiced Uatu the Watcher, the cosmic observer who appeared in several episodes, as well as a number of additional characters across the run of the show. It was common practice in animation of that era for a single voice actor to cover multiple roles. But Frees brought such distinctiveness to each character that listeners rarely noticed the overlap. His portrayal of the Thing was described in David Perlmutter's Encyclopedia of American Animated Television Shows as one of the elements that helped compensate for the production limitations of the animation itself.
Every command.
Not all mankind will obey. Not the Fantastic.
Fact 5. The Galactus trilogy was compressed into a single episode. In the comics, the introduction of Galactus and the Silver Surfer is a 3-issue storyline. Fantastic Four issues 48, 49, and 50, published in 1966. Known informally as the Galactus trilogy, it's considered one of the greatest stories in Marvel Comics history, a sweeping cosmic epic that fundamentally changed the scale of the Marvel Universe. Getting all of that into a 22-minute Saturday morning cartoon episode was no small challenge. The writers had to make some significant cuts and adjustments. The most notable change involved the character of Alicia Masters, Ben Grimm's blind girlfriend, who had played a crucial emotional role in the original story by connecting with the Silver Surfer and appealing to his conscience. Since Alicia Masters never appeared in the 1967 cartoon at all, that role was reassigned to Sue Richards. It was Sue who reached the Silver Surfer's humanity and turned him against Galactus. The story was compressed, reshaped, and retold in under half an hour, and that episode remains one of the most ambitious the show ever attempted. Fact 4. The show was canceled because of the violence controversy. The Fantastic Four only ran for one season of original episodes, 20 total, and its cancellation had less to do with ratings than with the cultural climate of the late 1960s. Throughout that era, a growing movement of parents and advocacy groups was pushing back hard against what they saw as excessive violence in children's television. This wasn't a fringe concern at the time, it was a genuine national conversation, with congressional hearings, editorials, and organized letter-writing campaigns, all putting pressure on broadcasters to clean up their programming. Networks came under increasing pressure to tone down the action in their Saturday morning lineups, and shows that featured any kind of combat or conflict were scrutinized heavily. The Fantastic Four, despite being a superhero series, was relatively restrained by today's standards. The show even used crash effect graphics, bold on-screen text like BAM or POW, similar to those popularized by the 1966 Batman television series, rather than showing direct physical impacts. It was a deliberate creative decision to stylize violence in a way that softened it. But in the climate of 1968, it wasn't enough to satisfy the critics. ABC canceled it, and the network moved toward programming that was considered safer and less confrontational. Ironically, the show had found its audience. ABC still aired the series in reruns for several years after the cancellation, a sign that there was still a genuine viewership for the show, even after original production had stopped. The audience didn't leave. The network simply decided not to make any more for them.
Our giants grows perilous.
Your power has exceeded my expectations.
Fact 3. Blastar appeared before he had even become established in the comics. One of the more unusual details about the 1967 Fantastic Four cartoon is just how current its villain roster was at the time. The show drew from Lee and Kirby's then-ongoing comic stories, which meant some of the characters it featured were genuinely brand new, not yet the classic villains they'd become in later decades. Blastar, the living bomb burst, a deposed alien dictator with the ability to discharge destructive blasts of energy, appeared in the cartoon's episode lineup after making his comic book debut in Fantastic Four issue number 62, which had a cover date of May 1967. That means the show was adapting an essentially brand new character, one that had barely had time to establish itself in the comics before being animated. It speaks to how tightly the production was tracking the source material. The writers weren't just going back through the back catalog and picking the most famous stories. They were staying close to what Lee and Kirby were producing in real time, which meant the show occasionally pulled in characters before those characters had even had time to build a following among comic readers. For fans watching at the time, it meant the cartoon and the comics were almost running in parallel. If you were buying the monthly issues at your local newsstand, you might have seen Blastar debut in print and then turned around weeks later to see him show up on your television screen. That kind of immediacy gave the show a sense of connection to the larger Marvel world that most cartoons of the era simply couldn't offer. Fact 2. The rights situation has kept the show-off home video for decades. Here's a strange consequence of corporate history that has frustrated fans for years. The 1967 Fantastic Four cartoon has never received a proper, widely available home video release in the United States. And the reason comes down to who owns what. When Hanna-Barbera produced the series, the rights to the show were split between Marvel Comics and Hanna-Barbera Productions. That kind of arrangement was common in the television industry of the 1960s and 70s, but it created significant complications down the road when the companies involved changed hands multiple times over the following decades. Marvel, of course, was acquired by the Walt Disney Company in 2009. A deal worth over $4 billion that gave Disney control of the Marvel brand and its vast library of characters. But Hanna-Barbera's library, including its share of the 1967 Fantastic Four cartoon, had been purchased by Time Warner, the parent company of Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers, of course, owns DC Comics, Marvel's biggest direct competitor. So, the 1967 Fantastic Four sits in an unusual limbo, a Marvel property partially controlled by the company that owns DC. Each side holds a piece of something neither can fully exploit without the other. The show aired on Cartoon Network in the 1990s and on the Boomerang channel in 2000. But after Disney acquired Marvel, the situation became complicated enough that no formal, widely available home video release has followed. It remains one of the harder classic cartoons to track down through official channels, a victim not of its quality, but of decades of corporate history.
Escape is quite
Fact 1. The show was referenced in the 2025 Marvel Cinematic Universe film. After nearly 6 decades, the release of the 2025 Marvel Cinematic Universe film, The Fantastic Four: First Steps, brought renewed attention to the long history of the team on screen, including that very first animated outing from 1967. For fans who grew up with the Saturday morning cartoon, the arrival of a big-budget MCU version of these characters carried a particular kind of weight. It's a long road from a 20-episode Hanna-Barbera cartoon produced on a tight budget to a major Hollywood film. But it's the same 4 characters, the same dynamic, the same family. It's the kind of detail that most audiences would walk right past, but for someone who grew up with that Saturday morning show, who knows the voice of Paul Frees as the Thing, who remembers the green-skinned Galactus, who watched Prince Triton stand in for Namor without ever knowing why, that kind of reference lands differently. It's a connection across almost 60 years of storytelling, a thread running from a small studio in 1967 all the way to a major Hollywood production in 2025. For a show that only lasted 20 episodes, ran into rights trouble almost immediately, and has been locked away from home video ever since. That reference is something. It's a reminder that the 1967 Fantastic Four left a mark on people that corporate complications couldn't erase. The kids who watched it grew up. Some of them eventually made it into the industry themselves. And somewhere in a Marvel film made in the 21st century, there's a small sign that nobody forgot where this all started. On a Saturday morning in 1967 on ABC. And there you have it. 15 weird and wonderful facts about the Fantastic Four cartoon that brought Marvel's first family to Saturday morning television back in 1967. A show born from a kid's comic book, designed by a legend, voiced by some of Hollywood's most versatile talent, and gone before most people even realized how special it was. It never got the long run it deserved, but it got something rarer. It stayed in people's memories. If you enjoyed this trip back in time, please give this video a thumbs up. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think. And if you want more deep dives into the cartoons, comics, and pop culture that shaped our childhood Saturday mornings, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got plenty more where this came from. Thanks for watching.